Hello class, today I'm going to share the story of how Paul Bunyan tamed the Whistling River. You see, the Whistling River got its name on account of the fact that every morning it would rear up 200 feet and let out a shrieking whistle that could be heard for 600-mile radius. It was the orneriest river in the US of A. This river took a fiendish delight in messing with those who toiled on it daily. It would take logs and tie them into knots. It would throw loggers into the water and onto the banks, and it was even known to break entire rafts of logs up the second they were made. This in and of itself wasn't enough to get the mighty Paul Bunyan involved. For Paul was a worldly man. He understood that nature was mysterious and sometimes troublesome to those who worked in it. One morning he was sitting up on the hill, minding his own business, combing his beard with a massive pine tree, when the ornery Whistling River reared its head and spat 419 gallons of muddy water into his face. But Paul was patient. He figured if he let the ornery river be, it would leave him be as well. But he was wrong. The ornery river reared up again, and this time it spat 5,019 gallons of muddy water into his freshly groomed beard. Not only did it spit water, but with the water there was a batch of turtles, there were several fish, and even an angry muskrat. Paul Bunyan couldn't take it. He stood up and let out a yell so loud that a landslide happened all the way over in Pike's Place. He yelled at the river, "By jingo, I'm gonna tame you if I bust a gut doing it." But Paul had to come up with a plan. Paul sat back down for 4 straight days, and during this 4 days, he ate 4 massive sacks of popcorn. He ate so much popcorn that little white specks of popcorn began filling the air, and in a 3-mile radius, 18 inches of popcorn fell. This confused the local animal population so much that many small animals and a couple dozen birds believed they were stuck in a blizzard, and so they froze to death. This unfortunate event led to the loggers in the local camps being well fed with pot pies for several days. On the 4th day of Paul's sitting and thinking and eating popcorn, he came up with an idea. I'm going to wrap that river up with a chain and I'm going to yank it straight. But Paul was intelligent. He knew that a log chain couldn't wrap up fluid water. So he went and grabbed Babe the big blue ox, and they took a walk up to the North Pole. Once they got to the North Pole, Paul crafted a big box that he baited with icicles and left along the trail of blizzards. Then while they were waiting, they walked down to the shoreline. Paul picked up great big huge glaciers and he heaved them out into the ocean for Babe to go fetch. However, this game of fetch didn't last long, because every time Babe jumped into the ocean, a huge tidal wave rose. This tidal wave was so big that it threatened to swamp the shores of Florida. Paul and Babe decided they'd be better off just enjoying lunch and maybe taking a nap while they'd waited. They took a nap and returned to the traps. Once they got to the traps, they realized that they had captured 6 blistering cold blizzards and 1 great big old gray nor'wester. Paul picked out the 2 coldest blizzards and threw them in his sack. He let the rest of them go, and him and Babe headed home to do battle with the orneriest river in the US of A. Once he got home, Paul hollered over to Ole, the great big Swede, "Hey Ole, make me the biggest log chain you've ever made." And Ole set off. Then Paul went and staked out his blizzards. He set one on the right side of the river and one on the left side of the river, and instantly the steam began to coalesce down the river and a nice glaze went over it. When Paul woke up in the morning, the Whistling River was frozen so solid that it couldn't even let out a whimper of a whistle, and he knew it was time. Paul grabbed that chain from Ole and he wrapped the Whistling River from head to toe 72 times, and he harnessed it on to Babe the big blue ox. Then he hollered down the river to the loggers, "Heads up, coming through!" He hollered back down to Babe, "Pull!" And boy did Babe pull. Babe pulled so hard it turned the chain into a steel rod, and it dug him into the ground up to his knees. But I'll tell you what, that ornery river didn't budge. Paul knew Babe needed a hand, and so he lent him one. Together the two of them yanked, and they pulled, and they yanked until that river busted out from the banks, and they took off running across the prairie so fast that steam was coming off the river. Paul looked back after a while, and he realized that the once kinked Whistling River was as straight as a gun barrel. But it was a lot shorter. Paul looked out on the horizon and realized that all the kinks in the river were now running wild over the prairie land. Paul Breen, as previously mentioned, an intelligent man, grabbed his big old double-sided saw and a bunch of baling wire, and he set out and he carved those little kinks into 9-mile sections. Then he rolled them up and he tied them up, threw them over his back, and he took them with him. Legend tells that later, when Paul was working out in the desert and there were no rivers to be found, he'd use those captured rivers to float his logs back up north. You see, Paul was confused when he came back to camp. He thought he'd be a hero, but the loggers were upset with him. Every morning, the Whistling River was the one to get them out of bed. Now they had no means of knowing when to wake up. It was just about this time that Squeaky Swanson was coming into camp. The thing about Squeaky is when he talked, you could hardly hear him. It was like a whisper. But when he yelled, you could hear him clear out to Kansas. Paul realized that Squeaky was the answer to all the problems. Every morning, he'd have Squeaky wake up before the crack of dawn and walk to the center of camp. Then Squeaky would let that yell loose and knock all the blankets off the loggers' beds. Being up in the northern Midwest, they knew that it was cold. And once that cold hit them, every logger was up and working. So not only did Paul straighten out the river, but he also helped Squeaky find his calling in life. And that's the story of how Paul Bunyan straightened out the Whistling River.